Thanks very much. This is my first society rodeo, and it's great. So I've really, it's been fantastic meeting everyone, and thanks for having me, and thanks to ZSL for, I always thank Anne Sylph and Emma for looking after me in the library. So I have this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to talk about giraffids, because the zoo has a long history, and the society with giraffids, 90 years this year. So that's the theory. I'm going to try and talk about a whole set of different things that this society's done in this period, using the giraffids as examples. So that's the official reason, and the other is I'm going to show you lots of pictures of giraffes and okapis. So it's after lunch, so I'm going easy. So fairly well-known story, but the first giraffes arrived in 1836. There'd been one in England before King George IV, and these four sub-adult giraffes arrived from Kordofan region of what's now Sudan, and they came with keepers, Nubian keepers. You can see them from left to right. Kabas, Omar, and Abdallah, so the names we have only, and the giraffes, who they named. So the giraffes are named by them. Left to right, that's Zaida, the female, Mabruk, Selim, and Gubala. And the French trader Thibault is on the right, and they're all dressed up in sort of Ottoman gear, because this was the sort of exotic idea, and they were coming from Egypt, of course. These were not, and they were called Arabs often. They were not Arabs. These were Africans from what's now Sudan. They arrived via Malta, and they were moved into the giraffe house, the new one, still the giraffe house with modifications today. And in 1839, Zaida gave birth to her first calf. And they did pretty well. They produced 17 offspring, and they survived. This sort of group survived in the zoo until 1882. And as a result, the zoo became a bit of a pioneer in looking after giraffes, reproduction, and also giraffe anatomy of all those that died, of course. So there was always that relationship with the pro sector. And as you can see in the picture, bottom right, fairly traumatic business transporting giraffes for everyone concerned. And this kind of slightly sad thing is adult giraffe are too big to transport. So pretty much you shoot the mother and you take the transportable sized giraffe. And so the newspapers later grumbled that the zoo would have to pay extortionate amounts to buy them, but then you couldn't sell them because of the railways. The railway tunnels, you couldn't fit them, you couldn't send them around. By the 1870s, certainly by then, giraffe were widely kept across zoos in Europe. They breed quite well in captivity, but they're prone to disease and stress. So as I suggested, 1882, the last of the first giraffe died. And at that time, someone's already mentioned the Mahdi, there was the rebellion against Egyptian rule in Sudan, British supported, so they couldn't get any from Kordofan. So they had to look elsewhere, and eventually in 1895, they got a southern giraffe from Portuguese East Africa, Mozambique. She was called Daisy, and she did rather well, survived until 1906. And then they needed a breeding stock, so 3 males, young males, arrived 1 year after the other, but none of them survived for very long, from different parts of Africa. And then finally in 1902, a male and female arrived from the Kordofan. And the female of these, Nellie, produced the first calf born in 40 years at the zoo, and that's Maggie, bottom right. So this always was a huge public event, very great interest in these in giraffes. And the one thing is that these giraffes were arriving from all different parts of empire, and they obviously noticed differences. And so there was great interest in taxonomy, and the Zoological Society supported Lydeker's taxonomic research on this, and which were published in the proceedings. And so Lydeker recognized 2 kinds of giraffe, Giraffa reticulata and Camelopardalis, the sort of common giraffe, and you recognize 10 subspecies. So it's complex taxonomy that's only very recently changed again. One thing struck me going through all this was that although there was this interest and knowledge of different species and subspecies, they didn't make any attempt to prevent breeding across across these. They very much wanted more giraffes, and so Daisy was impregnated by Daisy from the very southern by a Kordofan giraffe. So I wanted to say something about anatomical studies, and of course the most famous person involved in this was Richard Owen, and he published this paper in 1838 on notes on the anatomy of the Nubian giraffe. There were actually three. One of them was ZSL giraffe. And in the preface to this paper, he has a bit of a moan that, you know, all this exotic wildlife had been coming to Europe since Roman times, but not one bit of scientific knowledge had been gained. And therefore, he thought things had really looked up, that the zoo now was promoting not just entertainment of the public, but also the chance for scientists to study these animals. And it was both live, studying observation of the living animal, and dissection of the dead. So that's quite a clear statement early on scientific aspirations for studying living and dead animals. And he wrote this very detailed anatomical description, which became a kind of founding text on giraffe anatomy, certainly in this period. And then in 1839, Zaida's calf died. Born on June 19, had died 9 days later. And what's interesting about this paper is it's sort of presented as about the dissection of this calf, but there's quite a lot of natural history observations on the reproductive behavior. So the courting, the mating, the pregnancy, the birth of the calf are all described in this paper. Of course, everyone was the first calf in all this time, and people were really quite worried. And the calf, Zaida rebuffed the calf at first, and the really anxious keepers jumped in and tried to take over all the normal things that happen immediately after birth, including feeding, and of course this calf died. And Owen, in fact, recommended that in future we should not do this. We need that birth should take place in a secluded place, and keepers should not intervene. And of course, what he didn't mention was that he also said that he'd measured the calf minutes after birth, so he was really interposing himself between mummy and child. So, yeah, and so they did this. In fact, the next calf was born in 1841. They did the seclusion, and it worked. This calf developed really well. So Daisy died in May, and to everyone's surprise was found pregnant. And the prosector then, Frank Bedard, examined the fetus. He found some interesting things published in the proceedings. And for example, it had no marks yet on its coat. It had a very creased neck, which he deduced was because the neck was still going to grow a lot. And Ray Lancaster, director of the Natural History Museum, also had a look at this fetus, and partly because he was pretty sure that Richard Owen had got it wrong about the development of where the ossicones on giraffes develop. And so, but the evidence had been destroyed from Richard Owen's dissection, and he proved, in fact, Richard Owen was wrong. He published this also, something on patterning in giraffes, and he presented this at a ZSL meeting. So as many people have said, these meetings were really important meetings for spreading, for sharing knowledge on these. And of course, the okapi had been discovered, and one of the things everyone was thinking about was, how is it that these giraffids are so differently patterned? So he was interested in the potential for giraffes to have stripes. And there have been many further studies. So this was the kind of thing I was going to say about anatomical studies on giraffids. Particularly, unsurprisingly, there have been studies on blood pressure in giraffes. You know, how does a 6 meter tall animal bend right down to drink and it doesn't get dizzy and fall over and its brain isn't flooded? So there's been some naturally sort of questions answered. Alongside the science and the formal science done by the masters of the scientific universe of the time, I didn't have a picture of Owen. I didn't want to distract you after lunch. But if you can picture Marty Feldman, you've pretty much got it. Keepers, of course, had developed this amazing tacit knowledge on giraffes, and it's very little published. Bartlett published some of it in his articles and books. But they take a lot of looking after. The feeding has to be, you have to tie the food up high enough for them. There's all sorts of things. Their hooves, they develop a lot of problems on their hooves, so you need a substrate. You might see today, you look at the substrate and you think that's a bit harsh for them to live on. They kind of need it to wear their hooves. They're very prone to startle, they're very nervous, and many died from shocks, breaking legs and injuring necks, running into things, even though they're so large. They're not aggressive, even though they're very powerful, but they can dislike individuals. And apparently, if you see a giraffe and it puts its ears back, time to leave. There's a very famous example of a male giraffe that took a swipe at a keeper, missed, fortunately, left a big dent in the wood, and it's been preserved as a memento in the giraffe house of this narrow escape. And as you can see from the pictures, there was a lot of interaction allowed, including feeding, and every animal seems to have been fed buns for some reason, but not very helpful. Also, giraffes are very prone to lung, kidney, and bone diseases and nematode parasites. So they've kept the zoo veterinarians really busy trying to keep giraffes alive, and this is work that's ongoing. Oh, and second but not least, the okapi. So I'm going to say less about them because I've given 2 talks on okapi here already, but they're really important species here, discovered, of course, by Harry Johnston, and they had assumed it was some kind of rainforest zebra. And that's already been mentioned. They were hoping for a Harperian many-toed horse. But the first evidence for the existence of this animal was sent here, presented at a meeting in 1900 here. So I don't know. Yeah, there's this question of when it was discovered. Everyone says 1901. I guess it was named in 1901, but the first remains sent here, and they were the leggings. These, they look like Dr. C.S. legs. They're straps bought from a Congolese soldier, sent to Sclater and shown by him as evidence of a new species of zebra from the Singliki forest, as the paper says. And these are the type specimens in the Natural History Museum. Then the following year, Johnston received a couple of skulls, and because when he was a teenager, he came drawing here, and he was very talented. He was invited into the Prosectorum, and he learned anatomy. And he was also then sent over to the Hunterian collection and illustrated scientific papers for people, and became a pretty good anatomist through his art. And he knew immediately, looking at the skull, the lower bilobed canines, that this was giraffid, which was possibly even more sensational. And so this society was a really important part of the early stages of describing this. And that's my favorite cartoon. That's a very strong okapi carrying Ray Lancaster, a large person in every way, a wonderful person who needs a biography. And he gave it its name and gave it a new genus, so that it really was a big sensation at the time. And of course, he published the first really thorough, important paper on the okapi. In fact, a paper presented here in 1901, but it took months and months and months and months and months to publish it in 1902. But it stood for a very long time as the major publication in English. And Harry got one of the very rare gold medals for his discovery of this beast. I'm not going to say much about hidden histories, but I've just talked a lot about Europeans, and in my book I talk a lot more about this. But if you go to the Natural History Museum and you read the papers and you read the newspapers, all those stories about white men alone through Africa, despite the 80 bearers and all the Cook and the Skinner and the names you'll find associated with these animals, the first taxidermized mounts and such are the people shown. But in fact, in my book, I find that none of them saw an okapi. Most of them never even saw one alive. They hired local people. So there's a whole other story there. So the first live okapi arrived here in July and it was an Easter weekend sensation, but died in November. Up to now, the only knowledge was of durable parts, things that could get back in one piece from the Congo. So this was a huge opportunity, and a total who's who was assembled to dissect this animal. Unfortunately, a lot of it wasn't published because it went on into the war, and so people just didn't get back to it. But a lot was learned for the first time about the insides of an okapi because of this. The cause of death was cirrhosis of the liver, and they found helminthic abscesses. So LIPA found 20 parasites in the carcass, 8 of them new to science. And this was really helpful because when another 3 okapi arrived in Antwerp, Geoffrey Vivers was sent over to choose one, and he decided on the one with the least. And this was Buta, who arrived in 1937 and did rather better, lived to 1950. They got a female eventually, the last to arrive from Africa in 1949, but it was too late for poor old Buta, and Zendi died in September. So there was this big gap. But since 1981, so Kibali and Biloto arrived much later, 30 years on, and they bred successfully, and this zoo has had a copy ever since then. So there's a huge amount of sort of tacit knowledge, and I talk about this a lot more in my book. So I wanted to also talk about field studies, because we haven't talked about that very much. And in fact, ZSL did support field studies fairly early on. It was mainly seals in the UK, but quite a bit of work in East Africa. 2 people I'll just mention, 2 women. So the pioneering giraffe behavior, Anne Innes Stagg, she was Canadian, and she did incredible work, not funded by ZSL, but published by ZSL in 1958. And then Jasmine Sidney, who I'd never heard of, did a huge 2-year tour of sub-Saharan Africa and wrote this massive survey of ungulates across Africa, including a very detailed chapter on giraffe, talking about the taxonomy. And it's an incredible resource, and most people I know don't know who she is. I'd love to know if you know who she is. Please contact me. And ZSL published this magnum opus in 1965, and this was really conservation-relevant information on distribution of ungulates, and it was compared to the situation in 1900. So finally, just bringing us a bit more up to date, a century after the discovery of the okapi and showing of okapi, ZSL started working with the National Conservation Organization in DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo. They did a big survey in 2008 in Virunga National Park, and they found a small scattered population, and in subsequent discussion they realized that the IUCN Red List assessment of the time was inaccurate. It was near threatened, and people got quite worried. Especially John Hart did a 2009 survey of the Reserve de Faune d'Okapi, which is the national park for okapi, finding a significant decline over the past 10 years. So they decided to do a range-wide survey, and ZSL got the remit to develop an okapi conservation strategy. But unfortunately, there was huge unrest, as so often there is. In 2012, the RFO headquarters was attacked, people were killed, all the captive okapi were shot dead. So this really curtailed work in the field, but they pulled things together, what they had in 2013, and the first okapi conservation plan was established 2015 to 25, and the IUCN Red List status was revised up to endangered, and a specialist group was set up. Right, missed. Yeah, sorry. To conclude, as a zoo, later Institute of Zoology and Conservation Charity, then there have been these kind of seminal contributions, certainly with giraffids, across all of these various areas. So a huge amount of contributions if we look at the giraffids anyway, but certainly the field conservation part of this arriving a bit later. And just finishing and seeing as I'm at the zoo, how about an okapi conservation plan for the next 10 years, guys? That would be great.